Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 75. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode.
Well, my name is Lynn Evans and I'm from the Eydon Historical Research Group, normally known as ERG. So Eydon is a small rural village in the very sort of south of South Northamptonshire. It is an interesting historic village, and the history group was set up in about 1996, really to research the history and then to publish its findings, and we're just about to launch book 13.
Now, this particular item, it's a piece of textile. Tell me what the object is.
The object is a black cape. It has ruffles on it, it has sequins, it has a bit of fringing. It's a sort of cape that a woman in the late 1800s or around 1900 would perhaps wear to church or a funeral or something significant in a village.
So it's a fairly formal item then?
Yes, I think it is. But this is not the costume of somebody who is very wealthy or famous. This is the costume of somebody who's an everyday person.
Now, this item, which has got a lot of detail in it, it tells a story. What is that story?
It tells a story, about this exhibition in Northampton, the very same week that the granddaughters of the Tyrrell family approached us about a collection of costumes. The Tyrrells were tailors in the village from the 1840s onwards, right up until 1960s. Annie Tyrrell collected these costumes, various items, mostly made, we believe, by her grandmother Flora, who was the wife of Tyrrell the tailor. The Tyrrells were a Methodist family, quite upright citizens, though of course nonconformity was not without its conflict with the established church at this time. And they had a neighbour living in a cottage that actually belonged to them, and her name was Harriet Treadwell. Harriet Treadwell's background and way of life was different. She was married to a fairly unskilled labourer. She had a large family. They lived very much hand to mouth. So this cape wasn't the sort of thing that she would wear on a daily basis, presumably. And it's the fact that this cape was worn by her. Perhaps it was given to her as a gift, or perhaps it was something that she saved up for. We don't really know. But amongst this collection, this cape exists, so it must have meant quite a lot to these two women. It has a very charming label on it about Harriet Treadwell.
So it's an item which evidences perhaps a friendship, possibly a trade, but fundamentally it is of the village of Eydon.
It is of the village of Eydon. I mean, I said these clothes are not the people who are wealthy. They're everyday folk, and it really explains the sort of way they lived their lives in a village of that time. Respectability, of course, was all in Victorian times, so it says a little bit about that. It also says a little bit about the fact that rural villages were very self-sufficient. Every small village, and we're now talking of a village which has less than 400 people in it, had its own butchers, bakers, post office, harness maker, tailor. You know, they were very self-sufficient. Apart from the carrier, this was where they bought everything they needed.
So would the Tyrrells have been a family that the rest of the village looked up to?
I believe so, yes, certainly among the nonconformists. Joe Tyrrell and then Sid was very, very well thought of amongst the community. Sid went on to write books. He wrote a book called The Countryman's Tale, which was very much about living in rural Northamptonshire. It was published in 1973 when he was about 80. He then went on to write another book, which the history group that I belong to published in 2001. He did radio broadcasts as well and wrote other books, so he was quite a popular figure. He was a lay preacher. He also sold insurance, but he still maintained the family business.
And by comparison, the Treadwells were people who would have looked up to the Tyrrells?
I believe so, yes. Harriet and Jim, well, he was one of the last brickmakers in Eydon. So he did have some skills, but I think he was mostly labouring. They lived in a hand-to-mouth existence, really. They had many children. I believe from Sid's books that Jim also quite liked to frequent the Royal Oak, whereas, of course, the Tyrrells, being Wesleyan, would have been teetotal.
The Treadwells might have produced the bricks to build the homes that people in Eydon lived in, but in the meantime, the Tyrrells were making the clothes that those people would have worn on their backs.
Absolutely, yes.
It's an interesting take on village life and the point that you make about self-sufficiency. The cape is black. Is that a reference to Victorianism? Would black have been the dominant colour?
I think black was a dominant colour. Also, if you didn't own many clothes, your clothes had to be suitable for all occasions, and those might well be funeral and more sombre occasions. There perhaps wasn't the money to buy more frivolous clothes. Yes, it was something special, something to be proud to own.
Would it have been, in a sense, a calling card of the person who made this particular cape to show off their skills?
The tailoring business was mostly concerned with making men's clothing, suits, also things like livery for Eydon Hall and that sort of thing. They made very few women's costumes. Flora apparently made her own husband's shirts, and she certainly made her own clothes and clothes for other people. There's a little story about it. That's Joe, when he had a run-on, would say to her, "Oh, I think you need to be trained to do buttons the tailoring way." And apparently she said no to that straight away. So I think I know enough. And so I think she was obviously quite confident in her own skills. We do actually have a sewing machine that dates back to the 1900s. Beautiful, in a lovely drawing room cabinet. So we believe that she sewed many of these items on that.
Technical skills.
Yes.
Technology of the day,
yes.
But also an example of the work and the work that would have been turned out. For the recipient of this particular cape, would this have been about showing out, of dressing up?
Yes, I think a lot to do with respectability, which was very, very important. You know, to be respectable was one of the foremost things in a Victorian society. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a lot to do with that. The sequins and the ruffles do give away a little that adornment was also quite important to people.
In a sense, quite quietly done, but nevertheless
yes,
there.
Absolutely, and I think that would have been the Tyrrell way. I don't think there was a lot of show about the way they lived their lives.
How carefully do you have to handle this cape?
Extremely carefully. I must say at this point, our extreme thanks to the Tyrrell family. Anna Brooks has been caring for these costumes for a long time. And you have to think about things like acid-free tissue, acid-free paper, keeping away from sunlight, clearly. Textiles are very, very perishable in light.
What's your personal reaction, if I may say so, as a woman, to this particular cape?
I think it's the story of these women. It's just a little insight into the way they lived and how it compares with the same. You know, I am a woman of the village now, and it's very interesting to know how women lived in the village where I live all those years ago. It brings it to life.
And what do you think this particular cape and the communities that it represents, both in its manufacture and also in its ownership, what does that say about Northamptonshire? Why should this item be in the exhibition?
Eydon was typical of many villages during the Victorian times. There was some conflict between the nonconformists, we had 4 chapels as well as the church in our village, which seemed like a lot, and it was very important, and it was mixed up with the sort of radical political views as well. I think this is important to show how rural life changed. I think the railway changed a few things as well. It gave people access to travelling around to different places, seeing different points. And we are on a sort of little edge of Northamptonshire, but things were still happening, and it still reflected what was going on. Obviously the railways, I mean, this is an interesting point just at the moment. But yes, the railways are all round us. Indeed, there were various houses in the village which were definitely inhabited by people working on the railways.
But also attitudes towards religion, conformity and otherwise, style, perhaps class, perhaps the aspirations of betterment through something as simple and as detailed as this particular cape.
Yeah. And indeed, Flora, her mother, had a hat shop in Northampton, and so she wouldn't have been unaware of the way that fashions changed. Yes, even though living in her Wesleyan, rather respectable things, these things still matter to a woman.
Lynn, it's been fascinating to hear you speak. Thank you so much for bringing the Cape into the exhibition, and thank you for telling me about it.
Very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.